Our shir this morning is sponsored by Cindy and Iz Wiesel and family, Le'il and Ishmas, Rabbi Yosef Zundel ben Arad Tzvi Yehuda Zichron Livracha, Yossi Robinson, in commemoration of his third yahrzeit, Yehi Zichron Baruch. Okay. Our topic this morning is Lag BaOmer. We know that tomorrow is already Erev Lag BaOmer. Tomorrow evening begins Lag BaOmer. And there are two great Talmudic personalities who are most associated with Lag BaOmer. And those two personalities, of course, are Rabbi Akiva and his Talmud, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So, in terms of Rabbi Akiva, we're going to spend most of our morning learning about the connection between Rabbi Akiva and this day of Lag BaOmer. But in terms of his student, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, what is the significance of this day of Lag BaOmer in connection to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? So Shlomo Yosef Zevin in the Moadim B'Halacha, so Rav Zevin Zatzal says the following, brings the following accounts of something that actually happened. And by the way, I've seen this in numerous other farms as well. But Rav Zevin brings it, the first place I saw was by Rav Zevin. And this is what he says. He says, Minhag Eretz Yisrael, shenogim leilech al kivrei Rashbi, zichron livracha v'Rabbi Elazar Brano, v'yom Lag BaOmer. He says, what's the source of this custom, to this very, very significant custom amongst the Jewish people, to go to Meron and visit the Kfarim of Rabbi Shimon and his son Rabbi Elazar, specifically on Lag BaOmer. And listen to this story. V'ha'ir Rabbi Avraham Alevi, Rabbi Avraham Alevi, who lived during the time of the Arizal. So we're talking about the 15th century into the early 16th century. Okay, he tells the following story. Shehu hayanoeg tamid lamar nachem b'birkat Yerushalayim. He had the custom to recite the Nachem prayer, which we say as part of our Shemona Esrei, on what day? On Tisha B'Av. So this Rabbi Avraham Alevi was mourned and experienced Zecher L'Chorban every single day, so much so that when he got to the bracha in Shemona Esrei of the Yerushalayim, every single day he recited the paragraph of Nachem as part of that bracha that we reserve specifically for Tisha B'Av. So he says, he was in Meron, and he recited, and he followed his custom, his practice that he took upon himself to recite Nachem every time he says Shemona Esrei. Okay, and when he finished davening, Amar lo Rabbi Yitzchak Luri Yazal. He says the Arizal came over to him when he at the end of davening. I guess they were together at the same minyan in Meron. Okay, and he says, Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had foresham that I have to tell you in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who's buried here, Sha'amar Lo, who said to him, meaning to the Arizal. Apparently, Rabbi Shimon appeared to the Arizal in a dream, in a vision, and he said to him the following: Amar li ish hazeh, lama hu omer nachem b'yom simchati. He says, ask this person why he's reciting Nachem, which is what? A remiss to the Avelut of Chorban Yerushalayim and Chorban Beit HaMikdash. Why is he reciting Nachem on the day, B'yom Simchati, on the day of my joy? The Arizal says he had this prophetic vision when he was at this minyan together with Rabbi Avraham Halevi, whoever this Rabbi Avraham Halevi was, that in a dream, Rabbi Shimon appeared to him and said, why is this guy continuing to mourn on the day of my joy? So what does it mean that Lag BaOmer is Yom Simchat Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? We often call it the Hilula, which means the celebration of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Now that word Hilula has come to be associated when it comes to other tzaddikim throughout history as being a celebration of their lifetime on their yahrzeit. So many people want to jump to the conclusion that as this is Yom Simchati Shel Rashbi, it must mean that this is the yahrzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. It's not clear, by the way, in halachic literature whether that's true. We refer to this day as the Hilula, the celebration of the life and work and teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but it's not clear that it's absolutely the yahrzeit, that it's this the day in which he actually passed. but rather it's the day of his joy. And the question is, what exactly does that mean? And we're going to come back to that question a little later on this year. Of course, now we can take a look at our sheets. Of course, the other personality associated with this day of Lag BaOmer is Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, of course, is the Rebbe of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And Rabbi Akiva, of course, is most famous for what his interpretation of the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim, which we laid last week. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor like yourself. Amar Rabbi Akiva, says the Midrash, zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the most important principle of the Torah. Okay. So, knowing what we know about Rabbi Akiva, we have to ask a question about this mantra. This becomes Rabbi Akiva's mantra: love your neighbor as you love yourself. But we know, as we're going to read in a moment, that Rabbi Akiva is also famous for what? The fact that in his lifetime, he rose to have at one point, 24,000 students, and they all perished. They all died. And they all died, as we're going to see in a moment, because we're going to learn this together, simply because they didn't love one another so much, right? They didn't have love and respect and mutual admiration. So how are we to understand all this? So we're going to take a deep dive now, for the next few moments, into the story of Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim. And we're going to look at two different versions of the story. We're going to take a close look and see that there are subtle differences between the two versions. And we're going to try to understand and make sense of this whole situation. How can it be that Rabbi Akiva becomes famous for teaching love your neighbor as yourself, that he can experience the loss of 24,000 students because there was no mutual admiration amongst them? Okay, so we're going to begin with the most familiar version of the story. That's the Gemara in Yevamot. There's text number 2 on our sheets. Amru, it said, Shnei Masar Elef Zugim, Talmidim Hayulo Rebbe Akiva, Migabat Arati Pras. Okay, it said that Rebbe Akiva had 12,000 Zugim, which means what? 12,000 pairs. We're going to talk about the word Zugim because we're going to see that that's one of the unique ideas introduced in this version of the story. The 12,000 pairs that of students Rabbi Akiva had that filled the whole land from north to south. The kulam metu beparak echad, and they all died at one time. Minei shalom nagu kavod zelazeh, because they didn't conduct themselves with honorably one towards the other. V'haya olam shomeim, the world remained desolate of Torah. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva until Rabbeinu Shabbat, until what? Rabbi Akiva went and taught the sages of the south. V'shana, and he taught them. Who were they? Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. V'heim amidu Torah otosha, and they what? Restored Torah once again. And now the Gemara tells us, Tana, it's taught, Kula meitu mipesach v'yad atzeret. They all died specifically between Pesach and Shavuot. Amar Rav Chama bar Abba, v'itema Rav Chia bar Avin, Kula meitu mitorah. They all died a terrible death. Mahi, what was it? Amar Rav Nachman Askara. They died of diphtheria, a plague of diphtheria. Now my question is this: if they all died between Pesach and Shavuot, if they all died between Pesach and Shavuot, why do we have the practice, most of us have the practice, that certainly everybody agrees that Lag BaOmer itself is a day where we don't have mourning, okay? But most of us end the mourning period with Lag BaOmer. So where does that idea come from? So one of the Rishonim, the Meiri, explains this Gemara and says the following: the Kabbalah B'yad Gaonim, okay, it was accepted from the times of the Gaonim, Shebiyom Lag BaOmer Paska Amita, that on the day of Lag BaOmer they stopped dying, okay? And therefore everyone agrees that on this day of Lag BaOmer there was no death. Either that's when all the deaths ceased, or at least it ceased for that day, and therefore everyone agrees that this day of Lag BaOmer is a day not to be a day of mourning, or at least an interruption, okay, if not the completion of that period of mourning. Okay. So that's the version of the stories that appears in the Gemara in Yevamos. We're going to see that there's another version of the story that appears in the Midrash Rabbah, and that's text number 3. Now let's take a close look at this text. We're actually going to read it a few times today. We're going to read it now, and then we're going to come back to it later on after we learn some other texts as well. But let's take a look at this, a quick look for our first reading of this text. Okay, the Rabbi Akiva Omer, and Rabbi Akiva taught. In the first version, it's being spoken about what? It's someone else speaking about Rabbi Akiva and his situation. In this version of the story, who's telling the story? Rabbi Akiva himself, okay? Shnei ma'asar alafim talmidim haya li migabar diarati pras v'kulam metu b'chayai ben Pesach la'atzer. Okay, so what are some of the changes we see in the story besides the fact that Rabbi Akiva is doing the narration himself?
The number of students.
What? One at a time. What?
Number of students.
Number of students, right? Because it says here 12,000 students. In the first text, it said 12,000 pairs. And again, what's the significance of this idea of zugim, of zugot, of pairs? Okay. Any other changes? They died. Now, in the first version, it said they died during the same time period. But here, he says they died during the specific time period, but bichayai, meaning what? Throughout my lifetime. This wasn't a one-time plague that happened in one spring between Pesach and Shavuos, and they all died, but rather it was ongoing. It seemed to be an ongoing problem in his educational institutions, and every year during his lifetime, his students were dying between Pesach and Shavuot. Okay, what else? Well, let's finish the story. Okay. Ubesof immediately shiva. In the end, I was left with 7 students. Okay. In the version in the Gemara, he rebuilds with 5 students. Here it says he's left with 7 students. The Eluhen Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemya, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Eliezer Bar Noshel, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Yochanan Asamvar. So we have a few different names and a few repeat names. Okay. Amar Lahem, he said to these new students, these 7 new students, Harishonim lo metu ela mimei sha'aita named Sarah b'Torah zelizer. He says, my first students, meaning the thousands of students, they didn't die for any other reason except what? That their eyes were narrow towards one another in Torah. So what exactly does that mean? Because that's different than what the Gemara says. The Gemara says what? They didn't treat each other with mutual respect. Okay? So what does it mean their eyes were narrow towards one another with Torah? We're going to come back to that question. And then he says, Atem lo tiyuke. You shouldn't be like them. Don't follow in their footsteps. Miyad amdu umilu kol eretz Yisrael Torah. And immediately they went out, these 7, and they spread Torah once again throughout all of Eretz Yisrael. Okay. So first let's do a quick review. What are the similarities between these two stories?
The time period of Pesach to Shavuot.
Good. Anything else? The number 12 appears in both of these stories, right? Now, do we have 12,000 and you have 12,000 pairs? Okay? So it's very interesting. If you take a look at Rabbi Akiva's life. Rabbi Akiva begins his life till the age of 40. He's an ignorant shepherd. Okay? And then he leaves his home at the age of 40, leaves his family, and goes to learn for how many years initially? 12 years. And then he comes back, and he goes back for another 12 years. So, 1 second. And we know that one of the Talmidim of the next generation of Talmidim who restores the Torah to the world is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. If we take a look at the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's life, what happens? At one point, he and his son have to hide from the Romans. And how long do they hide for the Romans in the cave when they're buried in the sand and they're eating from a charuv tree? What? 12 years. And then when they finally come out of the Ma'ara, out of the cave, after those 12 years, what happens? They've been learning so intensely that their Torah knowledge, everything they look at, is being burnt up. And they have to go back into the cave for another 12 months. So the number 12 throughout all generations of those connected to this day of Lag BaOmer seems to appear over and over and over again. So says the Shvili Pinchas, Rabbi Pinchas Friedman, Shlita. He says, what does this all come to tell us? He says it teaches us that the Torah and the message and that's why that number 12 keeps popping up over and over again in these stories, is to teach us that the Torah is eternally relevant to all 12 of the Shvatim of Israel. The Torah is not the possession of an elite few. The Torah is not to be held onto by those who are the elitist and academics, but the Torah belongs to all of Am Yisrael, to all 12 of the Shvatim. We're going to come back to this idea because it's going to help us unpack all of these questions that are popping up. Okay, let's take a look at the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. It's a Mishnah we're all familiar with. This is text number 4 on our sheets. And this is going to help us begin to address the question, what does it mean that their eyes were narrowed towards one another in Torah? Oh, says the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kibel mehil v'shimai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai received the tradition from Hillel and Shammai. Hu haya omer, he taught, Im lamadat Torah harbe, if you've learned a lot of Torah, al tachazik tova la'atzmacha ki lakach motzarta. Don't take it as what? As a great accomplishment for yourself. Why? Because the reason why you were created was to learn a lot of Torah. So what exactly does that Mishnah mean? So if you turn your page, right? I think it's on the next page, right? So, the Avodas Yisrael of Kashnitz, this should be text number 5 on your sheets. The Avodas Elazar of Kashnitz, the great Maggid of Kashnitz, in his commentary on Pirkei Avos, he points to a pasuk in Eov. And the pasuk is, Adam le'amel yulad. A person is born le'amel, to toil, meaning to what? To toil at Torah. Hakavana biremes. Okay, the intention of this pasuk, okay, which is the same intention, says the Rebbe of Kashrutz, of our Mishnah Pirkei Avos, is to teach us what? Adam la'amel yulad. La'amel, the word la'amel is Roshei Tevot, Lomod Almenat Lilamed. Okay, a person comes into this world in order to learn Torah and to share Torah with others. This is the kavanah even here in our Mishnah. Okay, and also even on the pasuk in Parshas Bechukosai, Shatiyu Ameilim B'Torah, you should immerse yourself in the toil of Torah. Hainu Shatiyu Lomdim Amanat L'Lamed L'Acher, that a person should learn Torah in order that what? They should share it with others. Okay, doesn't mean that every single person now has to become a lecturer or a Maggid Shir. It means that every single one of us, if we learn something, we have an obligation to share that limud with others. So what exactly does that mean? And what is that exactly is the implication for our story about Rabbi Akiva and his Talmid? Okay. We're now going to begin to start the pieces all together. It's not the first time most of us will learn together. Typically, I start off with a bunch of questions, and it's a tapestry, and we hopefully answer all the questions as we go. Okay. So we're now going to learn from Rabbi Baruch Simon. Rabbi Baruch Simon is one of the Rosh Yeshiva in Yeshiva University. He has a beautiful set of Sfarim on Chumash called Imrei Baruch. And Rabbi Simon, in text number 6, is going to speak to some of our questions. Amar lehem harishonim lometu. Okay, he says to, Rabbi Akiva says to his new students, the first students didn't die, Ella, for any other reason, Mipnei sha'aytaneim, Saraba teraz zelazeh, atem lo tiyukein, miyad amdu milu kol eretz Yisrael Torah. Now he's going to explain this. Umevo ar mizeh, We can learn from this. Shesibat mitat talmidei Rabbi Akiva lo haya rak bigla shelo nagu kavod ze b'ze. The reason why Rabbi Akiva's students died is not simply what? That they didn't respect one another. Ela b'ikar b'nei shehaya lahem tzarot ayin b'Torah v'lo ratzu l'lamed Torah la'acherim. Rather, their eyes were narrow towards one another in Torah, meaning what? They didn't respect each other's knowledge enough to what? To want to share with one another and learn from one another. And that's why they died. And we have to wonder, Madua chamor davar zeh kol kach la'avi gzerat kal yom chalila. He says, why? You have to ask the question. Okay, so they weren't nice to each other, they didn't respect one another, but that should be a reason that it should cause this plague for all of them to die, God forbid? We have to ask the question, what does that mean? And we're going to come back to that question, by the way. So Rabbi Simon begins to answer, he has an answer. I'm going to suggest perhaps another answer in a few moments, but this is what Rabbi Simon says. Ulazot, Talmidei Rabbi Akiva shayoy neim tsar zelazeh v'ish et rehehu lo yozru v'lo hashpir luzlotav. Since the students of Rabbi Akiva, their eyes were narrow towards one another in learning, they didn't respect each other's scholarship, okay? And more than that, they didn't help one another, they didn't try to influence each other, okay? Oto tashchit, then their Torah knowledge was wasted, okay? It became intellectual property, not something that what? Became manifest through behavior. The reason why we learn Torah is not only to share with others, but to share with others so that what? They will feel closer to Hashem, they will be inspired, they will have an impact in the world as well. But if you're not doing that, then what? You're not only holding on to your own knowledge and not growing yourself, you're preventing others from contributing and growing. And this says, Rabbi Sami means that what? All their scholarship was simply wasted, was useless. Because no other human being benefited from them and their knowledge. And since they had no influence and impact, they were what? Put in the kares, they were ostracized. They were lost in the world. And that's what it means when it says that they died. V'zeh kidvarenu, she'im ein ha'adam melamed Torah la'acherim, azai hu ma'abed af et ha'Torah shel atzmo. This comes to teach us what? That if a person doesn't share Torah with others, then their Torah, no matter how much they know, their Torah will become lost as well. Ki ein mashpiim lo milmala chachma avinu, because at some point, that knowledge will cease to be descend upon them from above, because what? They're not being that proper channel to transmit that knowledge to the world around them. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Kol Shivracha, famously taught that even if a person only knows the letter Aleph, then they have an obligation to share that letter Aleph with someone who does not yet know the Aleph bit. Think about that. Think about that. So says Rabbi Simon, what does it mean? And he asked the question, how can it be that they would have such a harsh punishment? It doesn't seem like such a terrible thing. Okay, so they were snobs. They didn't share Torah with one another. Rabbi Simon said, no, because the whole purpose of learning Torah is to have an impact on the world around you, to share that knowledge with others, to inspire others, to lift others up, to encourage others to share. And because they didn't understand that, we'll take questions at the end, they didn't actualize that, they had to what? They had no purpose, says Rabbi Simon. If you have no purpose to be here anymore, then they cease to exist. Okay, that's Rabbi Simon's take. We're going to take a slightly different approach to this in just a moment. In order to do that, okay, and this is going to be, the approach we're going to take is going to be the Chiddush of the original approach of the Rashash. Everyone knows who the Rashash is, right? Rabbi Shmuel Aaron Shor, that's me, okay? And so we're gonna look at a Gemara together now, the Gemara Nedarim. The Gemara Nedarim tells a story of another one of Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. Maaseh b'talmid echad mitalmidei Rabbi Akiva shechala. There's a story told about one of the students of Rabbi Akiva who became ill. Lo nichnesu chachamim levakra, and none of the other Torah sages came to visit him. Imagine there's a Rabbi Akiva, this massive network of Talmidei Chachamim and Torah scholars, 24,000 koloniks, and one of them got sick, and not a single one of them came to visit their Chaver that was ill. Okay. V'nechnas Rabbi Akiva levakra, and Rabbi Akiva came and visited him. And since Rabbi Akiva swept and straightened up his house in front of him and cared for him, Chaya, he had a miraculous recovery and he lived. Amar le, so the student said to Rabbi Akiva, Rebbe Hechiyatani, Rebbe, you saved me. You restored my life. You brought me back to life. Yatsa Rabbi Akiva v'doresh. Rabbi Akiva went out after this experience and taught. Kol mi she'mevaker cholim ki'ilu shofech damim. Anyone who doesn't visit their friend who is ill, or at least expressed halachically to the Zman Hazeh with WhatsApp and with telephones, there are many ways to fulfill this mitzvah. Whoever is not engaged in the mitzvah of showing that we care about those who are ill, it's as if what? We killed them. Okay? So, having learned that Gemara, and having learned the insights of Rabbi Simon, who says that the reason why the students had to be lost in the world is because what? They didn't share their Torah with others. Okay? I now want to reread the second version of the story of Rabbi Akiva that appeared in the Midrashic. It's on your sheets again as text number 8. It's listed on the sheets again. We're now going to reread this, and we're going to reread it with the suggested chiddush of the Rashash. Okay, my suggested chiddush in this story. Okay, let's take a look. The Rabbi Akiva Omer Shnei Masar Alafim Talmidim Hayudim Migabat Al Antipras V'Kol Meitu B'Chayai Ben Pesach L'Atzer. Rabbi Akiva said, I had 12,000 students from Gabat and Antipras, and they all died in my lifetime between Pesach and Shavuot. Ubesof had Midu Shiva, and the end I had only 7. Ve'eluhein Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Nechemiv, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, Rishon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Elazar, Beno Shel Rabbi Yosef Aglili, Rabbi Yochanan Sanvar. Amar Lahem, I said to them, now last time we read this sentence, Harishonim lo metu ella b'nei sha'ita aneim tzara b'Torah zelazah. That the first ones that didn't die for any other reason except for what? That their eyes were narrow in Torah towards one another. But I want to suggest a different limud. And listen to how I'm going to read this Gemara. Harishonim lo metu. Hard stop. My first students didn't really die. Ella, rather, since their eyes were narrow towards one another in Torah, okay, aten lo tiyuche, you shouldn't be like them. Miyad amtu milu kol Eretz Yisrael Torah, and they immediately went out and taught Torah across all of Eretz Yisrael, filled Eretz Yisrael once again with Torah. What is Rabbi Akiva saying? Rabbi Akiva is, if we go with my chiddush for a minute, I'm not saying this is absolutely the way to learn this Gemara, but let's just go with it for a minute. What are we saying? Rabbi Akiva is saying, my first group of students, even though they were brilliant, and even though there were thousands of them, okay, because they didn't understand what that Torah knowledge was really all about, because they didn't share Torah with one another, because their lack of the willingness to learn and respect from one another and respect one another, okay, because it became so severe that one of them even fell ill, possibly during this plague, and none of the other students would come to visit that student. Rabbi Akiva said, what? The whole system had to crash. The system had to crash and burn. Okay? Not necessarily that they actually physically died, but what? It was as if the system was dead to Rabbi Akiva. And then he says, what? Don't be like them. Okay? You 7 students are going to be what? You're going to be my new hope. You're going to be the new hope of OUIsrael. You're going to go out and fill the world once again with Torah. Now, if we go with this limud for just a few minutes, okay? I'm not saying this is absolutely the limud. Obviously, we have this long-standing Masoret that they died, okay? And we have the version of the Gemara that said they actually died. But if we go with this limud for just a few minutes, so now I'm going to ask a follow-up question. If it's true that Rebbe Akiva's students didn't really die, so what are we mourning? What are we mourning?
The death of Torah.
Oh, so take a look at text number 9. This is Rabbi Shor and his beautiful sefer Halekach V'Alivuv. Rabbi Shor says the following: Ubepashtut yesh lanu la'avin al pi zeh ki inyan avelut shel talmidei Rabbi Akiva hu hamshechet me'avelut al chorban beit mikdashenu. He says, what do we learn? That the idea of mourning for the students of Rabbi Akiva is actually what? All part and parcel of what? The mourning of the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Ki miyom shechar Beit HaMikdash ein lo lakadosh baruch hu el daled hamot sha'alacha bilvad. The famous Gemara that once the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, there was no physical place for Hashem to place His presence, and therefore, if we want to experience a closeness to Hashem, where does His presence rest in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash? In the daled hamot, the proverbial 4 amot of halacha, of the world of halacha and limud Torah. Okay. Dahainu. Shesham be'elu dal amot yesh hemshech hashrat hashchina shaya beveit hamikdash. That means that when we learn halacha, what? We can once again experience a closeness to Hashem and a revelation of Hashem's presence in the same way that we experienced when we had the Beis HaMikdash. V'shichas HaTorah, chas v'shalom, and forgetting Torah, God forbid, hu hemshacha shachor Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, when Torah is forgotten, what? That means it's a continuation of the Chorban of the Beis HaMikdash. Ki Torah hu hamshachal shekadusha HaMikdash, because the Torah represents the continuation of the sanctity of the Beis HaMikdash in the absence of the Beis HaMikdash. And if we forget Torah, God forbid, then what else is being lost to us? Another portion of the Beis HaMikdash is being destroyed, so to speak. Now, listen to how Rebbe Shor brings this together. Yom Lag BaOmer hu hafsaka ba'avilut shel talmidei Rabbi Akiva. This day of Lag BaOmer is an interruption, an ending, okay, of the mourning that we have for Rabbi Akiva's students. Ki Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hu shamar, because it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who, as we said, is one of the next generation of the students of Rabbi Akiva. He's the one who taught, and with this we're going to transition to talk about Rabbi Shimon in the last few pieces here. He is the one who taught Chas v'Shalom sheshetishkach Torah miYisrael. His famous teaching is what? God forbid that Torah should be forgotten amongst the Jewish people. The Hilula de Rashbi yesh koach shel zichron Torah. And on this day of celebration of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there's the power, the capacity to remember the Torah. Levatela shichas haTorah shenigram al-yedei mitat talmidei Rabbi Akiva, to push aside the Torah that was, so to speak, the forgetfulness, the forgotten Torah that was experienced as a result of the death of Rebbe Akiva's students. And therefore this day of Lag BaOmer is a day of what? Of nechama, of consolation for that morning. This day of Lag BaOmer is a celebration of what? The restoration of Torah. Torah that was lost, it was forgotten. Okay, with Chorban bias and with those students of Rebbe Akiva who lost their sense of purpose and therefore had no meaning and therefore were lost, so to speak, whether actually physically lost or just their relevance was lost until Rabbi Shimon comes into the world. Rabbi Shimon and his contemporaries who restore Torah to the world. And therefore, on this day of the celebration of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we celebrate the restoration of Torah. Okay. Rabbi Moshe Wolfson, okay, Zecher Tzaddik V'Chal Shivracha, Rabbi Moshe Wolfson, in his beautiful Sfarim, Emunat Techa, Rabbi Wolfson says the following about Lag BaOmer and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. This is text number 10. V'zel gam kein ha'inyan shel Lag BaOmer. And this is also the entire idea of what Lag BaOmer is really all about. Ki Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai gila sheyesh pnimiut haTorah. Rabbi Shimon, what does Rabbi Shimon teach? The idea of pnimiut haTorah, the inner beauty and power of Torah, the hidden messages of Torah. And among those things that he taught was what? Okay, the secrets of Torah. V'al kol od v'od, and the significance of every single letter. Yesh tali talim. Within every single letter there are secrets upon secrets. Okay? So Torah, the secrets of Torah. V'echol acham OUisrael yesh la'ot b'Torah. And another idea that Rebbe Shimon taught us is what? That every single Jew corresponds to an oath in the Torah, a letter in the Torah. So if every single letter of the Torah has unending amounts of secrets and hidden inner value and significance, and every single Jew corresponds to a letter in the Torah, then what's the interpolation? That every single Jew has unending value and unending contributions they can make to the world. Okay, Gam l'chol acham Yisrael yesh pnimiut, and that means that every single Jew has an inner significance. U'b'chol acham Yisrael yesh sod niskav gavoa me'al gavoa sheshum adam afilu malach einu mevin alav. Okay, he says that every single Jew has within them incredible secrets and strengths and capacity to accomplish and do great things in this world that even the malachim can't even comprehend. And therefore, Lag BaOmer hu atikun le'achet shel Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, and therefore this day of Lag BaOmer is the day of tikkun, of fixing the transgressions of the students of Rabbi Akiva, shelo nagu kavod zeh b'zeh, that didn't treat each other with respect, shechashvu kol echad shechaveiro pachot mimenu ve'ein lo chashivut. Because they thought once, each one of them thought that their fellow was beneath them and wasn't important, had no significance. That's why the first version of the story talks about 12,000 pairs, even amongst the chavrutot, okay? Even amongst the learning partners, they didn't respect one another, okay? And therefore, and every single one of them thought what? They were smarter than their chavrusa. They were better than their chavrusa. Their chavrusa has no chashivas, has no importance. Aval b'Lag BaOmer, but on Lag BaOmer, nikalesh sheyesh l'chol echad. It's revealed that every single Jew has what? Nekuda pnimit, has an inner point of chashiva b'on, has an inner chashivas. Every single Jew has value and chashivas and can contribute to making the world a better place. To bring this all together, we're now going to learn, we mentioned him outside a few moments ago, Rabbi Pinchas Friedman Shlita. Rabbi Pinchas Friedman is a great educator in the Belzer Hasidic world today. His farm are known as Shvili Pinchas. He also publishes a weekly Parsha sheet that's very popular. I actually was turned on to the Shvili Pinchas a few years ago by my Rebbe, my Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Azariah Berzon. Many of you learned with Rabbi Berzon over the years. He also teaches Povasham for us here. And Rabbi Berzon introduced me to the beautiful Torah of the Shvili Pinchas that we're going to learn together right now. This is text number 11. Text number 11. And he's going to go back to the last lines of our Gemara. Miyad amdu umilu kol eretz Yisrael Torah. Immediately they went out and they filled all their Eretz Torah. It's the last lines of the version of the story that appears not in the Gemara but in the Midrash. I'm sorry. And this is, Rabbi Pinchas Friedman points to a beautiful teaching from the Tfilat Tzaddik. The Tfilat Tzaddik was the Bluzha Rebbe of blessed memory. And the Bluzha Rebbe explains Hapagam HaGadol Shel Talmidei Rebbe Akiva. What exactly was the great flaw of Rebbe Akiva's students? Now, this is the second paragraph here on text number 11. The idea is שהתלמידים הראשונים לא היה רוצים לענות זה לזה בתורה מחמת שנאה. The original students, what? They didn't want to find pleasure or please one another or excite one another with Torah because they resented one another. ולא היה מגלה כל אחד ואחד לחברו מה שיודע וקיבל מרבו מפני השנאה שביניהם. And what? They didn't want to share their knowledge or any of the knowledge they learned from their shared Rebbe, Rabbi Akiva, because of the hatred that was rampant amongst them, resentment that was rampant amongst them. וממילא מובן המכשלה הגדולה שיצאה מזה. And now we can understand the great michshel, the great impediment that came as a result of this. Okay? Acher, after, shekol ikar b'chinat Torah b'shval peh, okay, nismechet al mikablim ish mipi ish on Moshe Rabbeinu alayhi shalom. Why? Because how is Torah learned and shared? What is Torah Shebal Peh? Torah Shebal Peh is what? Transmission of sharing ideas, one to the other, generation to generation, go all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, Moshe Rabbeinu shared it with his students and colleagues. They shared it with their students and colleagues. We share generation to generation. Okay, it's sharing, it's speaking and expressing the words of Torah. As the pasuk in Mishlei says, that Torah is a source of life for those who more than grapple with Motzei means that what's the word Totzah means that through their speaking there is an outcome, right? For those who share Torah, literally for those who share Torah. Those who share Torah, Torah is a source of life for them. V'heim asuli lehefech. And these students of Rabbi Akiva, they did the opposite. They didn't share Torah with one another or with anyone. Lefichach nanshu, okay, mida keneged mida, hefech b'chinas hachayim, hamuftach l'motzeim. They were punished, therefore, mida keneged mida, measure for measure, the opposite of life, okay, because they didn't share Torah with others. Now, listen to what he does with this. Me'atan here, kilakach d'tkavein atana Rabbi Akiva shedoresh. Now we can understand, perhaps, the famous teaching of Rabbi Akiva. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, zeh klal gadol ba'torah. Daktik lomar, ba'torah. L'lamdinu shebe'esek haTorah, tzarich l'kayem v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Okay, linhog kavod zeh l'zeh. He says, what does Rabbi Akiva teach us? V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha zeh klal gadol ba'torah. When we learn Torah, the most essential idea we have to have in mind in our limud Torah is what? Treating our fellow with love and respect. And if we don't have that in mind when we're learning Torah, then our Torah is meaningless. Okay? Lilmod u'lamei Torah zamizeh. So we have to learn and share Torah with one another. Shalom k'mo shenagu Talmidei Rabbi Akiva, shahita eineim sarak b'Torah zelazeh. And not to conduct ourselves in the ways of the students of Rabbi Akiva, whose eyes were narrow in Torah, one towards the other, who refused to share Torah one with the other. I want to close with one last idea just to bring this all together. It's not on your sheets. Okay? So it says the Shvili Pinchas that we just learned. The idea of Yahavta l'recha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah, the essence of what learning Torah is all about, is what? To love our fellow. And if we don't have that in mind while we're engaged in learning, whether it be in a shir, whether it be in chavrusa, okay? If we don't treat each other nicely when we go to shir, if we fight over where we're going to sit in the shir, or we argue with our chavrusa, not because we're trying to get shot in the Gemara, but because we don't like one another, then we haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of the Torah. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, zeh klal gadol b'Torah, says the Bolshevik Rebbe. Okay. The Sfas Emes takes this a step further. The Ger Rebbe, in explaining the pasuk v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, he asked a famous question. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. What does that mean? Love your neighbor as you love yourself. So seemingly the Torah's definition of the mitzvah of love your neighbor is dependent on what? How much we love ourselves. Except I have a problem. Does the Torah give us a mitzvah to love ourselves? Is there any pasuk in the Torah that tells us what it means to fulfill the mandate to love ourselves?
Kamocha means yourself.
Right, but again, no. But again, the pasuk is v'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love the neighbor like you love yourself. So if the whole definition says the Tzfas Emes, so whole what? Okay. Okay. None of that is love. Says love. The words v'yahavta. Okay. None of that says the word v'yahavta. The Tzfas Emes says the definition for loving your neighbor is seemingly, if we take this pasuk at face value, seemingly what? Is taloi, is dependent on what? Us first fulfilling the loving ourselves. But the Torah doesn't define how we fulfill that mitzvah. So therefore, as the Tzfas Emes, how can we ever fulfill the mitzvah of loving our fellow? Because the Torah doesn't define it for us. So the Tzfas Emes says, no, you have to learn the pasuk differently. Listen to what he says. He says you have to put a comma after the word v'yahavta. He says, v'yahavta, the Torah, we have a mitzvah in the Torah of what? V'yahavta es Hashem Elokecha. V'yahavta l'reacha kamocha. The mitzvah of v'yahavta, of loving Hashem, should be for your neighbor like it is for yourself. Listen to his words. V'yahavta et Hashem liyot shei shamayim mita'ev al yadecha. What does it mean to fulfill the mitzvah of loving Hashem? To be a conduit, what? That the love of heaven, of Hashem, will be spread through your deeds, through your actions. When the world around you sees you living a life of Ahavat Hashem, of being a Fabrenta Ohev Hashem, of someone who loves HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not to get on a soapbox and preach down to others, but when others see what it means to live a life of Ahavat Hashem, then what will happen eventually, says the Tzfas Emes? Your neighbors will come to love Hashem as well. And that, he says, is the definition. Okay, just as a person has to work and strive to allow the love of God to penetrate his own heart, so too through his actions, through being a shining example of what it means to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, may it be that we also are able to share and encourage that love to grow within the hearts of our fellow. And that's what it means, that this is the essential idea of Torah. My friends, as we prepare for the awesome day of Lag BaOmer, whether we want to suggest that Rabbi Akiva students really died, or whether their purpose was lost from the world, and therefore the whole system had to crash and burn, and Rabbi Akiva had to start over. However you want to learn that part of the story, the message of the story is very clear. And it's a message that's eternal for every single one of us. We celebrate Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because it's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai who reminds the world, let's remember what Torah is all about. He learned from Rabbi Akiva, who had to learn the hard way, that sometimes we have to start fresh. Sometimes we have to make a clean break, and sometimes we have to encourage positivity and remove negativity from our lives. My bracha for every single one of us is that indeed, as we celebrate the awesome day of Lag BaOmer, that we should always keep in our hearts this idea of loving our fellow Jew, understanding that the way to inspire our fellow Jew is for us to be a shining example of what it means to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that Be'ezrat Hashem, in so doing, and in treating one another with respect, we will see others come to embrace Torah as well, even if we only know Aleph. Even if we only know Aleph, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we have the capacity to share that Aleph with someone else and bring them closer as well. And that's my bracha for all of us. Have a great week.